Here are 5 effects you can try out on your next player cutout. Number 1, we'll start with basic sharpening. So there's a few different ways in Photoshop you can sharpen your image. Let's start with the high pass filter. So if you duplicate your cutout layer, I've got my Josh Klein cutout all set up in Photoshop right now. Duplicate the layer using Command J and then go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. And we can keep the radius somewhat low on this, but we can also tweak it later because this is a smart object. We've got a smart filter in the high pass filter, so we can come back to it. But let's start with like 5 pixels. And then what you want to do is set the blend mode of this high pass layer to, I would say either overlay, soft light, or hard light are going to be your best bets. These you can see will add varying amounts of detail, soft light being the most subtle, but we can turn it on and off. You can see it really like sharpens the edges. You get a little more detail in his face, in the jersey. Overlay gives you a little bit more detail, and then hard light probably gives you the most. And feel free to mess with the opacity of any of these effects. If there is ever too much sharpening going on, just bring the opacity down until it feels right to you. So let's just go with some soft light at maybe 50%. Maybe a little bit more. Let's go 70. So it's subtle, but it definitely helps the image pop a little bit more. The next thing you should do, and really I do this on all my player cutouts, is go to your initial cutout here. So this is the high pass cutout. This is the initial cutout. And let's go up to filter and camera raw filter on our initial one. And you can mess with these settings. I have a video that goes into more detail on how to add pop to your cutouts, but we can go through some basic adjustments up here, and then adding texture and clarity are going to be your best bets of adding detail and adding some sharpening to your image. So let's keep those above 30, hit OK, and now you can see even more detail added to our initial cutout. The other way you can sharpen an image is going up to Filter and Sharpen, and then Unsharp Mask is the one I would recommend, just because it lets you play with the amount and the radius and gives you a little bit more control. Obviously, this is a very extreme effect as it's showing now. I wouldn't recommend using this for low resolution images. I would say only if you have a lot of pixels to work with and a lot of pixels that can be sharpened would this be maybe necessary, but I think sticking to the camera raw filter, texture, clarity, and then the high pass filter are probably enough basics for your sharpening needs. So I'm just going to cancel this effect and we'll keep things here. Effect number 2 is this smoothing effect, which is basically just reducing all of the noise in your player cutout. So I'm going to delete this high pass filter. Don't need that anymore. Let's go back into our camera raw filter, and we'll keep these settings the same, even the texture and clarity, but under detail, we're going to crank this noise reduction basically all the way up just to see the extreme version of this effect. And you can see when the noise is not reduced at all, we have the normal sharpening of the player, but when you crank it up, it kind of smooths everything out. It gets rid of any graininess in the image, which is kind of a cool effect. You can see we've got our smooth cutout. This is what we started with, and this is how he looks now. It's very smooth, very glossy, almost like an oil painty finish to him, which is an effect in itself. If you go up to Filter, Stylize, Oil Paint, you can play with that one as well. That one, again, would work better with high resolution images, so let's just stick to this general smoothing effect in camera raw filter. Super easy to use. Effect number 3 is the black and white skin tone effect. I've got another video on this effect going into more detail. You can basically use either gradient map or hue and saturation or a black and white filter for this. The key is just masking the parts that you want to be black and white. So I'm making this gradient map, clipping it to our initial cutout by holding Option, hovering in the space between layers, and then going into our gradient map settings. We'll go to basic, just black to white, mask, and we can adjust this middle slider between points, brighten him up a little bit. And now this mask is on the gradient map right now. We're just gonna brush back in, hitting B for our brush tool, and then bracket keys are the shortcut to shrink or make bigger your brush. Let's use a black brush to paint in the parts that we want to not have the effect on it. So basically the blue in the sleeves, I'm just gonna take the soft brush and paint this back in. We'll keep the skin tones totally black and white. So I'm gonna brush back. And using a mask, if you hit X, you can go back and forth between this white and black foreground color. Black is gonna hide the layer, white is gonna show the layer. So right now we're showing this entire black and white layer, but we're painting in black the parts that we don't want it to affect. So again, that is just the sleeves in this case. And you can turn it off and on to see what parts we're missing. So we've got some shorts color here. And you could probably put a little bit more thought and precise effort into your design. I'm just kind of quickly going through, but generally this is the idea. And while we're here, I would say it's always a good idea if you have like the team color on the jersey, try to match it the best you can to the background color. And we can do that using an adjustment layer, selective color. Also hue and saturation can be useful for this. So again, I'm gonna clip this to our player cutout by holding Option. And yeah, we've got the blues selected here. So now we can play with these sliders and just try to match it a little more closely to what the background is showing right now. And it's just gonna make your design look a little bit more consistent across the board. The next effect is the Radial Blur. So I'm gonna turn off this gradient map layer. We can keep selective color on. Basically, we just wanna duplicate this layer and drag it behind the current cutout. So I'm gonna hold Option and click and drag. So we have a duplicate layer right behind it. And on this duplicate layer, let's go up to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. And we want Zoom as the blur method. Let's keep it at 20 and hit OK. And you'll see it just kind of gives this like fun little pop of motion blur behind our cutout. And you can play with this. Like if you didn't want the feet to have a blur to them, you could put a mask on this layer by clicking our mask icon, go to your black brush, and brush out the parts that you don't want blurred. Like maybe you only want his upper body blurred or something, or just the parts going side to side. Maybe you don't want it on the head either. You can play with this effect to your liking. You can adjust the strength of this blur too. You can double click back in as long as you have this as a smart object. And if we want to crank this to like a 40 or something just to see an exaggerated version, you can do that too. And if you had it more subtle, like at a smaller blur, I'm just gonna take off this mask entirely, but let's go to like a 10 blur. You can also put a mask on your initial cutout and mask out the parts that you want blurred. So I'm gonna put a mask on this, and if we like brush out his leg, now we've got this fun blurring effect going from his lower body to kind of the focal point, which is his upper body in this case. And maybe we take the edges too, and maybe even his head. So now it's like the only part that's in focus is just his face and his arm. So it's just a cool way to kind of draw attention to a specific part of your player cutout. The last effect we'll go over today is the Duotone effect. And we're gonna do this with a gradient map again. Love gradient maps if you couldn't tell. This effect is gonna work better when we just have a flat background, and I'm also gonna add some grain over the top of everything. So what we wanna do is go to our gradient map, and this one I'm not even gonna clip to anything because I want it affecting the entire design. Duotone is basically two colors, right? So like right now it's this Minnesota wind chill blue and the black. So we can do something like this where we're dragging the slider in and we're just getting a design that has two colors in it basically, and then a slight gradient between. We can also get rid of this blur just so we can isolate the effect a little bit more. And I'm gonna do this with light blue and white actually. So again, let's just play with these sliders in our gradient map until we have something that we like. And this effect also might be a little better if you blow up the cutout. So we can take our cutout and make him fill more of the screen. And you can fine tune your gradient map a little further just by clicking back into it. And if you wanted like, you know, certain parts of him kind of fading into the background, that is always an option. Yeah, so like there, and then we could take the cutout, put a mask on it, and maybe just get rid of these spots. So it's more like even fade into the background. So another cool concept for a poster design. Hopefully those 5 effects will help you out in your next design.